we're looking at skill sets that we normally wouldn't associate with food production in Nigeria. So for instance, critical thinking, research, design in terms of mechanical, physical design, to design, this kind of project. Now, I just want you to talk a little bit about it, because one of the theories that I have is that one way to innovate our way out of this food security problem is to attract new skill sets. If we are going to get more young people involved, we have to create the kind of problems that their skill sets will solve. So what do you think about that?
Well, you're seeing it already. When you look at some of the most popular agricultural companies in Nigeria today, you're seeing ICT, you're seeing social media marketing, you're seeing fabrication, you're seeing reverse engineering, you're seeing biology and tissue culture, you're seeing just innovation as a whole. And it's the only thing that will get us to compete on a global in global world. What I'm doing is nothing new. It just happened to be new in Nigeria, but it's something that was over 30 years old. You know what I mean? It's older than me, it's older than many of you. So you're looking at technologies that there's nothing new about it, but it's in being applied. How do you apply it? Nigeria is doing amazingly well when it comes to creating technologies and innovations. Many of our innovations are sitting on the shelf at many of the academic institutions, So the biggest issue for us is how do we focus on things being applied? You'll see that even in the finance sector, one of the biggest things now is agri-fintech. So not fintech, not agri-tech, but agri-fintech. You see companies like Thrive Agric, Farm Crowdy, and then every other one that has followed them. And they're realizing that people want to invest their money. There is no money in Nigeria. Yeah. There's money, but there's no money. Yeah. And everybody is looking for a way to make that money. And they're now seeing agriculture as the green oil. Yeah. Mind you, sorry, there's one thing I want to mention is that in watching this movie, one thing we didn't discuss is the high carbon footprint that agriculture actually has. Yeah. Which I want to get to after this. Yeah. But yes, we are seeing that if you want to make it in agriculture, you have to do it differently. Yeah. Like they said in the video, it means mechanization. It means increasing your yield. And the only way to do that is to make sure that you focus on precision agriculture. You strengthen your food system. So it's not just rural farmers producing everything because they can't produce everything. It's giving the rural farmers the ability to maximize their production of what they do best, right? Yeah. So products that need lots of land, yams, maize, sorghum, things like that. And then you now focus on what other areas can add to the food system. Yeah. And that's why I'm such an advocate for urban farming, because each of us can actually add value to that food system to help reduce. If we're focusing on these rural farmers doing all the tomato farming or doing all the pepper farming when we could do it ourselves, then we're actually missing out on the beauty of a holistic system. I went to Zambia, and in every yard, they are producing vegetables and they have a cow. Every yard, no matter how small, every balcony, they are producing food. How many people in this room are producing part of what they eat in their own home? Can you please raise your hand? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5. Oh, okay, maybe 6. So I can count on one hand the people here that are producing, which is actually good because I've been to places where 1 or 2, right? So the question is, where does it start? If each of us can actually add to that quota. I remember when I was a kid, my mom always had strawberries hanging in her kitchen. Mini strawberries hanging in her kitchen or something growing outside. How can we add value to the food system? So those are things that we need to think about. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the best and brightest minds. It can just be average, Angel and Aisha and Ayo, just adding value to the food system. So.
There's another thing I want you to speak to, which also came up in your opening statement. You found a plumber.
Yeah.
He wasn't trained to be a specialist in building greenhouses. Now, one of the definitions of innovation for me is finding new uses for old things. But those old things could be old skill sets. Are there other examples, especially in your experience, other examples of skill sets that we'd see around, for instance, construction skill sets and so on, that would see around that could be useful in other parts of the food value chain that could add value?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. You don't have to. So, for example, how do you build optimum cattle pens or pig pens for farms as an architect if you don't have an understanding of agriculture and the agricultural system? Many people will call an architect, design this for me, but if you don't understand where the feeding should go, what the flow should be, how you bring the animal in and how you take the animal out, where the feces should be should go and how you need to wash it out. If you don't understand sustainability and build sustainability into the model, then you'll see what we always see, which is people investing so much in agriculture and in the infrastructure, and maybe 5 years later or 10 years later, their farm is nowhere to be found. So these are some of the skills that need to come into play. People who have engineering skills. There are lots of young people who create their own vegetable dryers. And so they make solar dryers. We need agriculture to, we need energy in agriculture. And how do you power agriculture? There was a gentleman who talked about solar and the need to be able to use solar. There's also hydro. There are companies who want to, they're on waterways because they need irrigation, but they also want to use that waterway to be able to create hydropower to be able to power their plants. What about methane gas? Like I said before, agriculture has one of the highest carbon footprints compared to other sectors. And when you look at that, you realize that even just cattle production, the methane gas that is created and generated with cattle production means that it's not sustainable, it's not climate protective, it's actually degrades the environment, right? So how do you harness those things? How do you use biodigesters to help create energy? You know, how do you make sure that your farm, all the waste from your farm is being used for something else? So the cattle waste, the chicken waste is being used for other things. The water from the fish, how do you make sure that your farm has the lowest possible footprint as possible? And as Nigerians, we don't really think about climate change. We're actually the victims of climate change. We don't actually add so much to the carbon footprint, but we are the people who are facing climate change. You see flooding. You see that even for people who have money, we are all living in a fragile state. So the money that we have isn't really taking us that far, because come tomorrow, if your house washes away, if the foundation of your house washes away, I don't know if insurance is going to pay in this country. So we are all fragile. It's not just those in the rural areas, and they face it the most. They're living day to day. They have difficulty in making their money. You see them plant rice today, and the floods have just spoiled their crop. But you also see people having difficulty even in urban areas. You see places like Lagos, you see places like Port Harcourt, and they're facing these challenges. So at the end of the day, we need to think about how do we protect ourselves, because nobody else is going to work towards that. And protecting ourselves doesn't mean that we should plant the whole of Nigeria clear the whole of Nigeria just to plant crops. How do we improve the yield of the farmers? And how do we make sure that we protect ourselves to maximize what it is that we're doing on an acre or on a hectare of land? I think that, like, I keep going back to this concept of everybody has a role to play. I would just love to ask randomly, can I ask the lady in the white, what do you do?
Me?
Yeah.
I'm an operations coordinator.
An operations coordinator. Yeah. Beautiful. When you think about what an operations coordinator could do for an agri company, most of the time, logistics is an issue. Even for small businesses, if you don't harvest your product and get it to your customer by a certain time, especially if it's a corporate customer, they will not take your product. So you have to come either the next day or you have to come the next week, depending on what days they have open to collect the product. If you have to get your product on a plane every morning, for those who know that, especially coming from either Abuja or Jos, you have to get your product on the first flight. If you don't get your product on that first flight, you're done. And your customer will not be happy about that, which means you then have to it's a temperature time control situation where the longer that product is out, the longer it's going to spoil because it's waiting to get on the next flight. So all of these things come into play. So that's where an operations, what is it again? Operations coordinator comes into play in terms of logistics, in terms of the operations of your business, in terms of maximizing the revenue that you're generating from your business as well. So.
And of course, it means that someone like that can offer their services to someone who's already producing, to smallholder farmers, You can design a service that works for smallholder farmers and maximizes their minimizes their logistical risks and maximizes their logistics output. Another question, I'd like us to look into the future here, because we're going to be 450 million people by the year 2050, in the next 30 years. That's going to be, and Obasanjo called it mind-boggling, and I don't know what it's going to look like in the next 30 years with 450 million people here. And our yields are not improving at the moment. The challenge is, how do we feed those people? Now, if you were to put on your imaginative cap, what would food production, what would the food value chain look like in Nigeria in the next 30 years?
The reality is that we can't get away from smallholder farmers. We can't. Yeah. For us to be sustainable, we also need to be inclusive. And so most countries that are the most efficient when it comes to agriculture have actually gotten away from smallholder farmers, where you end up having a family, maybe let's say 5, and maybe they hire an additional, let's say 10 individuals, and they manage a farm of enormous hectarage, and they use mechanization for their productivity. So the truth of the matter is that with the system and model that we have now, and with the smallholder farmers that we have to carry along, we will never be as competitive as those nations. However, we still need to develop models to start, and to at least kind of go down the runway before we can really take off.
So you think is aggregation one thing that you
not just aggregation, not just aggregation, but development of models that work in terms of finance. So you have to have every variable ready for everyone. So models like Babangona, where you aggregate the farmers, you make sure that there's access to finance, you make sure that there's insurance, you make sure that there's hand holding, especially if you can use technology to bring the farmers into the 21st century and give them access to information at the tip of their fingers, especially if you now also bring in the off-taker, which is the market, the person who's going to buy the product. And then, of course, if you also make sure that you're able to use economics of scale to be able to get their inputs, then you now have a system and a model that works, because you have the person who can guarantee that if this person produces, I will buy. You have the person that guarantees that if you will buy, I will fund. You have the person that guarantees that says, if you fund and you buy, I will plant. And so there's a model. One thing I've realized in Nigeria is that unless you have that full model that's foolproof, it's not going to work. Because one variable or another will be missing. And if you don't have that full model in place, the political class is never going to understand it and adopt it, because it has to be pushed from somewhere. One beauty about the model that Babangona Farms is using is that it started with CBN. And so because CBN created an intervention, and it wasn't just an intervention for an intervention's sake, it took care of every variable that you could think of that would actually be a risk or a barrier to making sure that the system worked. And it thought of it. So when you think about urban farming, or you think about cold chain, or you think about agric finance, or you think about anything, you think about it as a complete model. So think about every stakeholder.
Whole value chain solutions.
It has to be full value chain solutions, end to end. And it can be, for Benue State, it can be for Kogi State, it can be for this company, but it needs to be end to end to be able to work. Because when you resolve, the beauty of the reality is that you have so many development partners that have come into Nigeria and said, we are fixing cold chain, we are fixing storage, we're fixing the way that we package, we're fixing seeds, we're fixing inputs. And each of those pilots have come and gone, and what else?
There's not been any linkage.
That's it.
Because you haven't thought about farm to table,
Exactly. And so, yes, cold chain, but I can't afford it. But if you create a model where there's somebody who invests in cold chain, and then they have rates for which people can utilize that cold chain, but that rate, they don't have to pay up front. It can be linked to the person who's going to buy. Then you now start to see a model that sort of works for them. Or if you think about power and say, I alone cannot.
Bundled into
you have to bundle it into
the
exactly.
As a service, as part of the production service.
Exactly. So a lady who is into operations coordination would then think about, I want to provide this service to MSMEs. I want to provide this service to smallholder farmers. I want to not just work for a company, but I want to provide it as a, they always say software as a service, but service as a, as a solution.
Operations as a service.
Exactly. And then you now start to see that it's profitable for you, but it's also cost efficient for the everyday farmer. I think that's the same thing with logistics. It's the same thing with cold storage. It's the same thing with even inputs. One farmer may say, if I buy this inputs piecemeal, it's more expensive. But if I come together as a group and we leverage on specific platforms, it's cost effective. So those are the kind of things that we should look at, is models and systems that work, ecosystems that work.
Yeah, I think that's a definition of creating value, where it's cost effective for the farmer, it makes business sense to you, and it creates a product that the market wants.
I don't know if it's a question as much as something that you brought up, but I've never really thought about. The whole place of interrelation between agriculture and climate change, in the sense that, yes, climate change has an impact on agriculture, but the carbon footprint of agriculture is actually rather high. Tractors, and so it's almost like you're actually worsening the climate situation, or increasing the carbon footprint while still suffering the same consequence. So my thought is are there any creative thinking around technology that finds a way to solve that? Because my problem is it's almost like chasing your tail, right? If the reason why, for instance, you can't get fishes the way you will get them, or you can't plant the way you plant them because of climate change, and then you still need to have those large scale factors, tractors and the rest that still bring that. Isn't it like just chasing your tail and that cycle?
And let me ask a question back to you. So in the US and in Europe, they focused a lot on large-scale farming. And now they're moving away from large-scale farming, and they're focusing on urban farming, they're focusing on permaculture, they're focusing on solutions that help to protect their environments. And they're still telling us to clear our lands and produce on a large scale. And sometimes the innovation comes from embracing nothing new, but something traditional. I'll give you, for example, now you have European companies coming to Africa to teach us how to farm, create forests for ourselves and farm in the forest. The difference is that they've lined it where there's a tree over there, at where this pillar is, there's a tree over here where this pillar is, so you have more than enough space in between to bring a tractor in, to plant, and they focus on, let's say, Marlboro trees, where they grow straight up, rather than creating canopies, right? So you have enough, you have trees that can be economically active, economic trees for you. You plant them within a certain number of years, you can actually fall those trees, use them for timber or whatever. You're making money from those, so that's your long-term yield from that tree, investment into that tree. But then you can also provide produce here. You can also do that with fruit trees, other trees as well. Co-cropping is also a way to make sure that you're maximizing the space that you have. Looking at what you can plant with cocoa, or plants with plantain and bananas. You see people that are doing it in our villages, just that we've not focused our research on teaching them how to do it in such a way that maximizes for them and make sure that they're not losing on either end. So permaculture and just sustainable systems in general. Nothing fancy about that, where you're actually maximizing what you produce and how much money you can make on that piece of land. So,
and also to add, that's not really a problem at the moment in Nigeria. A big problem in Nigeria is it's food security, but it's also that we're cutting down trees.
So deforestation.
So we're cutting down trees to plant, either to plant or to cook food, or to dry food because we don't have storage. So our own carbon footprint is coming from deforestation and not from mechanization. So obviously the solution for us is different.
So that becomes, for that, it's the same solution though, because you want to focus on how do you, so for example, you're going to cut down the forest. Where are you replanting that forest? And how are you doing it in such a way where it's beneficial to both the farmer, to the communities? Because once you cut that down, it increases the temperature. For every 100 to 200 hectares that you cut down at a given time, it actually increases the temperature of that area, which makes it very, very difficult for you to farm the same crops. So farmers need to be also aware that even in terms of flooding, once the rains come, you start to realize that the trees are not able to protect you against the, what's it called, erosion that occurs. So even though mechanization is not our issue, deforestation, even access to water resources, all of those things become a problem once we're clearing those lands.
This is the second time meeting her. And the first time we chatted for just 20 minutes, I was inspired from Oluma Old School, please.
Okay.
I was inspired. I read Agric Extension, and I'm an agricultural science teacher. I've never heard about hydroponics, not until my principal saw a documentary on BBC and told me to go look for her. It took me months, and we saw her. And after some time, we could not see her again. Ma, I've done a lot of self-study on hydroponics, a lot. My problem is, how do I get these solutions? In their measurement, a lot of all the equipment used are not readily available in Nigeria. I've done a lot for myself. I've studied a lot. She actually pushed me that I don't have excuse. I don't have to see a job before I go for holiday. And I've done a lot about that. But my hands are still tied.
So one thing I'll say in terms of hydroponic farming, and I know this is not a lecture series on hydroponics, but for hydroponic farming, and one thing I've also moved away from is using solution. I've moved away from using solution to making my own. And from making my own, I now went into aquaponics. Now you're starting to see companies that are selling the essential elements, and you need to then be able to measure, calculate. So it becomes remembering your high school chemistry and understanding 1 mole of this to 1 mole of that, 1 gram of this, and then doing the calculation for your solution. And so you now have to go to the market, and then you'll be able to find there are companies that will sell some of these ingredients. You bring them together, and it will then create the elements that you need for your hydroponic system. Then some of the things like iron and other things like that, you have to find them and then measure them, and you have to make sure that it can dissolve into your system. So there's a whole chemistry on hydroponic farming that you need to be able to.
So essentially Breaking Bad, eh?
Exactly, for agriculture.
Heisenberg.
Exactly, for agriculture. But at the same time, you can do it in a more in an organic way, which is you can do compost teas. The issue with compost tea that I've experienced is that it clogs your pump. And so as you're doing the compost teas, you have to find ways to filter out the solids and just keep just the liquid solutions to be able to run into in your system. And then you can't guarantee what nutrients you have, the levels of nutrients you have in there, so you always have to find ways to correct. Aquaponics, for me, has been the best system because you add what you need to add, but in general, for the plants that I grow, nitrogen is the main component, and you're able to get enough of that for your system. So you're able to grow your plant, and then you now add some of the other ingredients that you'll need, and you find ways to do that, but the system is really an organic system. So when I started, I thought that when I'm marketing my product, saying that it's hydroponically grown would mean something. It doesn't mean anything. Organic, the truth of the matter is that it doesn't mean anything. So I focused a lot on just staying true to the way that I'm producing, but also making sure that I'm just selling it. So I need to be able to compete with the local market. If I'm not competing with the local market, what am I doing? So I have products that I sell to restaurants, I do microgreens, I do all of these other things, but at the same time, I still do a lot of spinach. And so my price of my spinach has to be the same as what they're selling in the market. The price of my mint has to be the same as what they're bringing from Jos. The price of any of my products, my basil, has to be the same with the price of African scent leaf, even though mine is Italian basil. You understand? So I try to make sure that I've cut my cost of production down low enough. And part of that is being able to say to yourself, what is the cost of my operation? What's the cost of my rent? Because I don't own the land that I produce on, I rent it, right? What's the cost of my electricity? What's the cost of my water? So over time, what was the cost of my borehole and the cost of pumping my water? My plants will pay rent, each and every single one of them, and I need to make my money back. So, so even though I thought that it would be something that people would be like, oh, wow, so amazing. They're more interested in the technology than the fact that the plants are grown with that technology. And in the beginning, when I would talk a lot about hydroponics, people will say, what is that? That's just is it cancer related? And then they always tend to compare it to GMO, and I'm like, GMO has nothing to do with hydroponics. Hydroponics is just like giving, okay, you eat a pizza, okay, sorry, you eat fruits, you eat an orange, right? Or you squeeze the orange and you drink the orange juice. You're still eating the same orange in a liquid version or in a solid version. That's really what hydroponics is the nutrients that are in the soil, you're liquefying it and you're providing it to the plants. And most of that nutrients comes from animal waste, from minerals in the soil, comes from rain water that comes and drops minerals in. So all of those things comes from degradation, animals that are, what is it called? Decomposing in the soil. So it's not actually the ground itself, because if it was the ground itself, you see all those areas that they showed that had been stripped of their minerals, they would be fertile, but they're not, because it's not the ground that matters, it's the nutrients in the ground. So all that grammar to say we're hungry in Nigeria and we don't really care where our food comes from, because if we really cared where our food comes from, we would be really passionate about food systems where our meat are not left out for flies to be on them. So at the end of the day, when we're eating suya, we'd actually care where the meat is coming from. At the end of the day, when we're eating vegetables, we'd actually care that the farm that we're getting those vegetables from have good agricultural practices, and nobody is defecating in the same field where they're growing your plants, because that's actually unhealthy. But the truth of the matter is, we're hungry. This country is in an economic calamity, and no, that's the truth. I don't think that we can all say that we are we are where we expected to be. Let's say 10 years ago, the hopes that we had for Nigeria, and now. Right now, we're really just trying to stay afloat and get to a next level. And so now the desperation that we have, we need to put that energy into production. And we're hungry, let's produce and just try to meet the needs of everyday Nigerians.
Okay, so I'm not sure my question is for you. I'm from a very different industry, so agric is very far from me. I'm from a practice solid mineral, so
okay.
Very far. But one of the things that jumped on me when we're watching the film was the 40% waste. And the question for me is, are there no guys at some point of the value chain that provide storage services, that would process here and there? Because 40% waste is for me is about half of it. And that's what I can think of.
I'll say something. Since we've been here this evening, the light has not gone once, right? But when you go to your home, I don't know if Yar'Adua has an inverter or anything like that, but the truth is, when you get home, some of you are even here because you're waiting to know if there's light in your house or not, because of electricity. And so all of us are waiting for government to give us light. Me, I was waiting for government to give us light. I got tired, I got some money, I got an inverter for my home, for my company, across the board. Electricity is one of the biggest issues that make it hard for a storage company, a cold storage company, to be profitable. Because if they're running that freezer on a generator, it's expensive. It's also the reason why agro-processing companies are not as profitable, because they are making their own electricity. And it's a higher cost of production. And even the farmers themselves cannot even compete, because you're using a gen to pump your water, or using a pumping machine at the riverside to be able to pump your water to your farm. There is no electricity. If government could do one thing for us and then leave us, give us light.
Period.
Give us light, and you would see a lot of the issues that we have are resolved. And you would see our production increases. You'd see that even Nigerian companies will be able to make their own seeds in Nigeria, so we wouldn't have to import seeds. You would see that our labs would be able to do more in terms of agric research. You would see that in terms of organization and logistics and things like that, we'd be able to talk to ourselves instead of waiting for a server in another country before the information now comes back to Nigeria. And you realize that even the educational system, people would be able to learn, then more people can actually learn agriculture the way it needs to be learned. So electricity, give us electricity, you've done half the job for us. So that's my own saying.